Welcome back to Capitol Journal. Joining me next is Steve Marshall, Alabama's Attorney General and now candidate for the United States Senate. Mr. Marshall, thanks for coming on the show.
Always good to be with you.
Well, the last time you were on, you were not yet a candidate. We were thinking about it. We were, because Tuberville had not announced yet for governor, and so but now you are. You've put your name out there. You're a candidate for the United States Senate. So I wanted to ask you just the most basic question: why are you running, or more importantly, why do you want to be in the United States Senate?
Yeah, it's interesting. You broke the story that I was really, we thought, done with running for public office in Alabama because governor just wasn't something that interested me. We made that decision last fall. But Senate's different. When you look at the issues and the areas in which we've been involved as AG, there's tremendous overlap in what a United States Senator does along with what the Attorney General does to protect the sovereignty of the state of Alabama. In fact, I was meeting with one of my former colleagues who's now in the United States Senate, and she was sharing with me that the work of an AG really is a great training ground for the issues that you face in the Senate. And so when Coach Tuberville decided to come home and that he wanted to go ahead and run for governor as opposed to run for re-election, very much piqued my interest, was something that when Tammy and I talked about what we wanted to do next, that made sense at the station in life that we're in right now. And look, I'm really excited about being able to get across the state and be able to share a vision for what I think I can provide, which is strong conservative leadership that's proven to be effective. We've taken on the tough issues in Alabama. We have not stood down. In fact, we've been very forthright in being able to fight for things that matter to the people of this state. And not only fight, but we've been able to be successful. And so excited to be able to talk about that.
Well, yeah, let's get deeper into that because, what issues do you think you want to focus on? Well, it's kind of a two-part because what issues are you going to focus on in the campaign, but what actually translates into being United States Senate, right? Because you talked about that. Some of the issues overlap for your time as Attorney General. So what issues do you think really matter that you want to impress to the voters? Hey, this is what I want to do when I become a United States Senator?
Yeah, I think there's several things. Number one, we're going to make sure that we support the president's agenda to be able to, being in D.C. for the 2 years that will complete the Trump term, is to make sure that we're an advocate for the issues that he is advancing. Immigration is very much an important question for us. A secure border matters, and we need to make sure that we have the tools to be able to secure that border physically. And then also to be able to provide our Border Patrol agents the resources they need to be able to do their job. Because when you look at the immigration issue, if you don't secure your border first, then you can't solve the remaining issues that are out there. And the one thing that we know is that the cartel has been able to use a porous southern border to be able to bring not only fentanyl into our state, and that's obviously a significant law enforcement issue. It's causing the loss of life across our country because of the powerful nature of that drug. But also we've seen the cartels being involved in labor and human trafficking, and we've got to make sure that we stop that on the front end. We have, as AG, been able to talk about the 10th Amendment and the limited powers of the federal government. I think it helps to have somebody within the body of the Senate that's able to remind their colleagues that the federal government itself has a very defined and specific purpose in the issues that we should engage in and those matters in which we should debate ought to relate specifically to those core principles that our founders got together. And then look, I'm a prosecutor at heart. I care about public safety and the men and women of law enforcement across our country. And I think you'll see me very engaged in discussions about what we can do to be able to enhance public safety.
You brought up immigration. I wanted to get to that because that's obviously one of the biggest issues going on right now. A lot of concerns about these ICE raids, not just in Los Angeles, but all across the country, including right now it's starting to happen in Alabama. In your view, is the federal government going about this the right way, or is it, there are constitutional questions, there are due process questions about how ICE is going about it? Are you comfortable with how DOJ and Homeland Security and ICE are going about this?
Well, obviously, much of that's being litigated, and we have been engaged supporting the Trump administration, their efforts, including, for example, the National Guard being able to be brought out in California to stop and what we're going on with the riots and be able to protect federal buildings. But look, we need to make sure when we see the number that came across into this country through processes that clearly were violative of the law, we need to be able to support ICE in being able to remove those who are here unlawfully. I think we ought to be able to target those who are here with criminal records, those who have violations of the law and have already proven if they can't abide by the laws of the state and of our country. We need to make sure that we're removing those. And then we need to make sure that we then are following the process that the immigration laws already lay out. If you have a valid deportation order, we need to make sure that those are executed. And to the extent that somebody was here on a parole program of whatever type and that period of time has expired, those individuals need to be removed.
Mm-hmm. It was interesting, so if you're elected to the Senate, this could be an issue that you actually vote on because, as you've said, the border situation has dramatically changed. Enforcement has dramatically changed just because of the change of administration. So I think that's worth stating. But the law hasn't changed. And a lot of people are asking the question, should it change? I was listening to Tom Homan, the border czar, the interview he gave. He's like, look, we're trying to enforce the laws that exist. If Congress wants to change them, and maybe they should. So once we get past this enforcement situation, can we get to a place where we establish an immigration system that actually works in terms of, folks that need to come here can come here, and there's a border that works and all that? Is immigration reform, legitimate immigration reform, possible in this political environment?
I don't think it's possible until we secure the border fully. Until you do that, then there's no ability to deal with everything else on the backside. And what we have faced as a result of the policies of the prior administration is immense volumes of people who've been able to enter this country in a way that isn't consistent with our immigration laws. And until you address that issue, I don't think you can get to the question of looking at the issue of reform, because until you know what the problem is fully, then I don't know that you're going to be able to take that next step. But look, as a member of that body, willing to engage and be able to advance policies that impact the state of Alabama. And I think, when we're talking about globally, my focus in the Senate, it's going to be what can I do to enhance the interest of the state of Alabama, whether that's our agricultural section, whether it's on the manufacturing side, and ultimately, what is it about the pocketbooks of Alabama that are impacted by what the federal government does? Immigration is one of those issues that can have an adverse impact, and I want to make sure that I'm securing the interest of our state when we have those discussions.
There are different kinds of senators, right? And Alabama's had a variety over the years. There are some who are quieter. There are some that are kind of behind the scenes. Some are more out front and everything. When you think about what you want to be, what kind of senator you want to be, understanding that Katie Britt's up there and she's establishing herself on the appropriation side and all that. Have you thought about committees, things like that? I know it's very early in this race, but have you given thought to kind of what kind of senator you would want to be for the state?
I can tell you, I'm very much interested in serving on the Agriculture Committee, Armed Services, because I think those are two fundamental areas for our state in ways that we need to be engaged. Want to be able to supplement what Senator Britt has already been able to accomplish during her time, and to make sure that there is that partnership that allows us to collectively be able to advance the interests of the state of Alabama. But look, I'm not going to be Richard Shelby, Jeff Sessions, Tommy Tuberville, or Katie Britt. I'm going to be Steve Marshall. And I think the beauty of this campaign is the state's had now 8.5 years, and we'll have 10 by the time I'm done, to see what kind of public servant I am. I mean, look, I'm not the most bombastic guy, right? I'm one that puts his head down and gets results. And I think that's the same thing that I would do as a United States Senator. I'm not worried about how much I would stand in the rotunda and see my face on TV. I'm not worried about how active that I could be on Twitter. What I care about is delivering results to the people of Alabama. And so, look, there's a lot that I can learn from those who have served before me. There's a lot that I can learn from Katie Britt. And the ability to figure out kind of what that role looks like, I think will be something that I'll grow into the job, just like as I have as Attorney General, because I wasn't necessarily just like Bill Pryor, Luther Strange, or Jeff Sessions as Attorney General. I think people have seen that I'm an individual that's willing to chart their own course. I can think independently for the issues that are in front of me, and I want to be thoughtful about the decisions we make, but most importantly, understand that it's the people of Alabama that put me there, and I need to do everything I can to be able to serve their interest.
Okay, I'm going to get you to put your AG hat back on.
We'll do it.
We had this ruling last week from the Supreme Court having to do with Tennessee's transgender treatment law for minors, upholding Tennessee's law. Alabama has a very similar law that was already adjudicated and everything, but this is a really significant ruling. Basically, upholding, deciding it was constitutional what Tennessee did. In essence, it's deciding what Alabama did was constitutional in terms of restricting or banning transgender treatments for minors. Talk about this ruling. How did the court reach its conclusion based on your reading?
Yeah, great decision to be able to protect kids across our country, and in essence validated the 27 states, including Alabama, that have already acted proactively to ban cross-sex hormones, puberty blockers, and surgeries on kids that seemingly suffer from gender dysphoria. The court itself really was confronted with kind of a very sort of discrete constitutional question, and that is, when these laws are reviewed, what standard of review and what level of scrutiny does the court give a state in being able to enact these laws? And what they determined, what is the lowest level, sort of rational relationship between the interest of the state and what they were trying to do. And what Alabama was able to do from the work that we've done in our case was to be able to give some factual context to the court and understanding that what was being said by the proponents, by those advancing the transgender agenda, was not accurate. We got into the underbelly of an organization called WPATH, and were able to show that their so-called standards of care really weren't research-based, but were more politically driven. We were able to determine that lawyers were having an influence on those standards of care to fit the needs of their litigation as opposed to the needs of kids. And maybe one of the most important concepts within kind of our medical ethics is informed consent, and where we were able to find that those doctors who were advocates of this type of treatment said, we can't explain this to kids and we can't explain it to parents. And then maybe the last thing is that we were able to demonstrate that the so-called science that they were advancing wasn't based in studies that were validated or replicated in multiple levels, but in fact, the systemic review of these studies showed that it's very unsettled on whether or not this is truly helping kids at all, and in fact, maybe harming kids long-term in ways that nobody has disclosed.
I was able to, as this court case was reported out and everything, I was listening to some of the, I guess you'd say the proponents of transgender kids and everything, some parents that were saying, look, you know, we've got a child who has known and has demonstrated from very early on that they wanted to be a different sex, want to be a different gender, and so restricting their ability to have those hormones, puberty blockers, whatever, really harms their child because they really don't want to advance past, you know, development and everything. So what do you say to that argument that, well, you know, we need this because, you know, that child is going to have what they would say irreversible things from developing those sex parts?
Yeah, one thing I would tell those parents is they were lied to. You know, what many parents heard from physicians and others that were advocating this treatment is, if you in fact don't engage in gender affirming care, your child's at an extreme risk of suicide. And what we learned as a result of what Alabama did and what was ultimately acknowledged in this committee case was that there is no increased risk of suicide for kids that don't receive gender affirming care. In fact, it's the opposite. The other is that this is not the only way to treat gender dysphoria. Historically, the small number of kids that identified with that condition had the ability to go to counselors and mental health professionals to help address the confusion the child had about their gender. It's an effective way of being able to deal with it without medical intervention and without any of the long-term consequences. The other thing I would say is that there are just sad stories to listen to detransitioners now who describe the adverse medical impact that occurred as a result of what was done to them, and for them to talk about the long-term consequences that they're dealing with. Look, it's a difficult situation for parents, and I respect that, but what Alabama has been able to demonstrate is that parents were not given the full picture, not only in the short term what could be accomplished to be able to assist their kids, but in the long term what would happen with the kids that face those adverse consequences. And so, again, proud of where Alabama is. It's interesting, commentators have said, and I'm really proud of this, that the greatest mistake of the Garland administration of DOJ was suing Alabama in this case, because we exposed the fraud for what it was, and now the nation is better off for what we've done.
And so our law is affirmed.
Our law is affirmed. In fact, the plaintiffs a little over a month ago voluntarily dismissed their case before the Supreme Court had ever ruled. And I think the reason for that is, number one, they saw the law had moved against them, But most importantly, the facts that we were able to develop in the record showed not only that Alabama had a rational basis to be able to protect kids from this type of care, but in fact, we had a compelling interest to be able to make sure that our kids were not the subject of experimentation.
Appreciate the explanation. Good luck on the campaign trail. I know we'll talk again, but I appreciate you coming on.
Thank you.
We'll be right back.